Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we are joined with Brother Imran Hussein from IERA, and we're going to be discussing his recent debate with John Richards. So, Assalamu alaikum, Imran. How are you?
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Good, bro. How are you? How's things?
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. I've been looking forward to this discussion as well because
Yeah, alhamdulillah. Likewise, bro.
I remember when I was watching the debate, some of the things he came out with made me want to pull my hair out, and it was a very bizarre debate. First of all, I wasn't expecting him to be so pro nihilism.
Yeah.
He seemed quite like to be an advocate of it, which threw me a bit off guard. I hadn't really heard of him prior to that. Did you go into it expecting him to be? I'm guessing you read his book, didn't you?
Yeah, no, I actually didn't expect him to be, for the very reason that I read his book, I didn't expect him to be so pro-nihilistic, if you like, or approach, because and even then during the debate, there was quite a contradictory view that he presented. On one end, he was saying, his opinions mean nothing, his views mean nothing, we're so insignificant, etc., etc. On the other hand, he was turning around and saying, well, the way he was talking and the way he was trying to make a case for his atheism, that my views do mean something, and even said during the crossfire in the beginning that I want a secular world, things like this. So it's a bit of a mixed batch. It's quite difficult to figure out at points as well as to what his particular stance was.
This is definitely one of my criticisms as well. It seems very flip-floppy. Like it.
Yeah.
And one of the issues with this as well is, and because this is something that like atheist advocates, they constantly bring up that they don't have a doctrine, and they use it as a sort of point in their favor. But what I tend to find is that this also causes a lot of issues for them because they're kind of associating with each other, and it also makes it difficult to deal with them when you're talking to them because they're very malleable. Like for example, we'll go into it. John Richards, within the debate, he claimed that he doesn't refer to himself as an atheist, which I found very bizarre because first of all, can I ask, the poster for your debate, it said at the top of his name, atheistic naturalism. Was that something that was put there by ISOC, or was that his own description of him?
I'm not too sure, to be honest, bro. I'm really. It could be either. It could be the ISOC. It could be himself.
It might be nice to maybe get in touch with them and get clarification on that. But like, basically, he admitted that he was a member of the Atheist Alliance. He's used with people like Aaron Ra on the Atheist Alliance International YouTube channel, and he's he's on their website as well. And if you go onto that website, it says who we are, and then it goes AAI, or Atheist Alliance International, is a global federation of atheist groups and individuals committed to educating its members and the public about atheism and critical thinking. So, if you're looking into him like on the internet, and you hadn't heard him say, "I do not identify as an atheist," you would, judging from what he says, very much assume that he was. And then there was a video I mentioned to you earlier, which is on that same channel, called Atheist Brandwash Proposal. He basically talks about how atheism is being demonized and so on and so forth. But the whole presentation is a presentation for atheists. And then he keeps referring to we. So we have been demonized. We have been called this. We have been called that, including himself in this, while he's made it clear that this is a presentation for atheists. So why he doesn't refer to himself as an atheist in that debate, it seems quite clear when you look at him on the internet. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or
so just thinking about the whole thing about the poster that you mentioned, that it said atheistic naturalism on top of his name. Well, he didn't contest to this. He didn't come out, even if it was the ISOC supposedly that put that title there, he didn't come out and say, well, I'm not an atheist in the beginning of the debate, or I'm not a naturalist. He seemed to be okay with this description. I'm sure he had a look at the poster before it, when it went out. So one thing I did notice was that through the course of the debate, he did seem to slightly amend his position. So near the end, I recall him saying something like, I'm not saying that there's no God. I'm just saying there's no evidence for God. right? So again, I know it's words, but words have meaning, and he seemed to be trying to now take almost a position that, okay, you can't call me an atheist, almost as if to suggest that the case you're making is a case against atheism and naturalism. It's not a case against me. So he seemed to sort of disassociate with atheism at that point, just to probably move away from the implications that I was suggesting that he had to deal with. Maybe that's just my analysis of the situation, but it did seem to be the case that near the he started off and he was, okay, this is my position. Obviously, I'm an atheist or a naturalist. Obviously, I don't recall him saying that, but near the end of the debate, he seemed to have shifted away from wanting to associate with that label as much. Hence, he was saying things like, "I don't deny there's a God. I just say that there isn't one." And even earlier on, he said things like, we're disbelievers, or we are people that don't believe in God, and we don't have a group or some sort of a society, which is individuals, etc. So it was very unclear. But something to point out here, bro, is that I've seen this as a very common trend amongst many atheists. What seems to happen is when you initially get into a discussion with them, they come across and they say, "Look, I'm an atheist. I'm a naturalist." They would clearly label themselves. But then very soon, they sort of disassociate themselves with that clear label. And when they're faced with the implications of the worldview, of their outlook, and they would even test against. They would say, "Look, don't call it a worldview. It's not a worldview. Don't call it a way of life. It's not a way of life. Don't call it a ideology. It's not an ideology. It's just a simple lack of belief." Whichever way you want to say it, as soon as you deny God, it has implications. Call it whatever you will.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? And and I think I pointed that out to him in the debate. So I said, look, I won't call it a worldview because you may not like that. But whatever the case, if you deny God, it has implications. Let's deal with the implications. Whatever you call yourself, it's a different story, right? So I've seen that trend. So maybe he was doing the same, but again, it was very unclear with him. We didn't have that much time during the debate to where I could really assess what he was, who he was, or how he really identified himself. I don't know if you got the same type of impression.
Yeah, well, it's not just him that I've had this issue with. It's pretty much most of the atheists when you're trying to kind of, well, what is it like? How do we describe you then? Because you seem quite happy to join these atheist alliances and so on and so forth. And when I'm watching you discuss things with each other, you don't shy away from this kind of thing. But like you say, once you've kind of been pushed into a corner and you've kind of pointed out the flaws or the problems with these particular concepts like naturalism, atheism, so on and so forth. It's at this point they seem to kind of deflect or enact these kind of red herrings and try to move you away from or disassociate themselves from it completely. There was a similar thing. There was a quote by what's his name, Sam Harris, and basically it was linked to this idea because another part of his debate he starts to move on to this idea that religion causes all this death and all this misery and so on and so forth, and he was very much trying to make this necessary link between religion and violence around the world, and he didn't want to concede the point that atheism was a motivating factor towards any of this violence that's occurred in the past century or so. And you rightly pointed out I think the Soviet Union as a great example of that.
I made a specific reference to the book War and Peace in Islam. It's a very interesting book where the author actually presents a study and he's collected all the data from the year 0 to the year 2008. And he actually categorizes, he doesn't just specify atheism or a specific group, he just categorizes as the anti-theist bloc, basically. And he shows that they are second to the Christians when it comes to, now, if we're going to play a numbers game, as far as death tolls are concerned. So, and again, it boils down to that point. It's like, call yourself an atheist, call yourself an anti-theist. There are implications. You are as soon as you make such a claim, you are associating yourself with a certain group of like-minded people. Anyway, so
it's this idea that a negative movement isn't a movement, but it is. Like once you've kind of if you're trying to dismantle certain ideas, you're not leaving people with absolutely nothing. You're leaving them with a vacuum. And then at that point, there's generally very similar things that vacuum gets filled with when it comes to atheists. It's obviously not going to be filled with theism or any other, like, if there's an atheist that's trying to deconstruct these particular arguments in favor of a religion, he's not going to try and convince you to then take up a different religion. If he's deconstructed your Islamic beliefs, he doesn't want you to then become a Christian or a Hindu. And so the question is, well, what is it that they try to fill that void with? They don't leave themselves in a void. They don't walk around just being completely indifferent about everything. There's motivations as to why they begin to critique these ideas in the first place, whether that be Islam or any other religion. It's because they come from a foundation, and then there's a conflict in values, and this conflict in values motivates their critiques. And so it's this idea that they're just being completely neutral, that they don't have any baggage, they're not trying to lead you to anything, they're just leading you away from a particular thing. It seems a lot of the time they're just playing this kind of semantics game, and refusal to show their cards, because it gives them an advantage. They can pull this thing out where they say, oh, well, we're not, like, for example, I'll read this bit here. So there was a point that something happened. It was called the Chapel Hill murders, and it was by some militant atheist. And he was constantly in his social media promoting atheism and things like that. And then he went out and he murdered 3 Muslims. And there was a lot of hoo-ha in the media about this, and people were trying to associate this murder with atheism directly. And in response to this, Sam Harris said the following in one of his podcasts, which he titled "The Chapel Hill Murderers and Militant Atheism." And he says the following: "Atheists simply are not out there harming people on the basis of their atheism. There may be atheists who do terrible things, but there is no atheist doctrine or scripture. And insofar as any of us have written books or created arguments that have persuaded people, these books and arguments, insofar as they're atheistic, only relate to the bad evidence put forward in defense of a belief in God. There's no argument in atheism that suggests that you should hate or victimize or stigmatize whole groups of people, as there often is in revealed religion." Now, my major problem with this is he's talking as if atheism is, again, just this negative thing. It's just trying to remove beliefs in religion from people, and that there isn't, how did he word it? There's no argument in atheism that suggests you should hate. But the way he's framing this is as though atheism cannot lead to hate at all. And this just simply isn't true. Just because it's not written explicitly in books, it doesn't mean that this kind of thing doesn't arise in discussions with people. When I was an atheist, and I was talking to people, there was often a lot of hatred for religion. And it was, very much this, oh, they're causing so much problems, if only they weren't about... and just because there's no explicit argument given in, mainstream books, it doesn't mean that this isn't something that comes up or crops up on, say, forums, private networks, things like that. And there's nothing about atheism that explicitly denies it. And then that's tied to this idea that they don't have a doctrine. And because they don't have a doctrine, you can't explicitly say that this isn't allowed within this thought process. And there isn't any sort of path that people can take or reason that leads them to wanting to fight theists.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you do see this. There are people, like the Jewish community, they suffer a lot at the hands of hate crimes as well, and things like that. And it's just, it seems bizarre to me that they try to kind of shift it and use this fact that they don't have a doctrine as a sort of evidence that, violence and things like that. Like he says explicitly, atheists are simply not out there harming people on the basis of their atheism. That's a very specific positive claim. And one that he's not got evidence for. And one that I've seen the counter of them. There are people who do not believe, who do actively attack people on the basis of the fact that they do. And so I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that in particular.
I mean, firstly, it's interesting because as soon as you put yourself in that position of atheism, the fear is of just the sheer amount of freedom that you have now, right? There's no accountability. you freed yourself from all potential accountability. That in and of itself is quite a worrying thought, and this is something such some of the existentialist philosophers pointed out too. Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, his biggest fear or problem wasn't necessarily that there's no meaning to life. His problem, his biggest fear was, well, what does that now? What does that mean now? That means that if there's no meaning, anything literally goes. Anything's a possibility, and that was a scary thought for him. That how do we now, get people to sort of focus and be responsible, so they don't just go and do whatever they want, because there's no meaning, there's no value, as I pointed out in the debate too, on atheism and naturalism. Anything goes, literally, right? So that in itself is a very dangerous position to be in. So hence, like, so many of the existentialist philosophers spoke about being responsible, making, understanding that you have a choice to make and making the right choices, etc., etc. Secondly, it's interesting that such statements come from Sam Harris, because he, if you read his works, The End of Faith and other books, he actually is quite aggressive towards religion. Yeah. And his writings are extremely aggressive towards religion, Islam in particular, in many cases. And some of the things he said in the past are quite shocking. And it wouldn't surprise me if some of his followers did do atrocious things towards religious people, etc. So coming from him, if anything, someone like Sam Harris, if he wants to now back up what he's just said here, he should probably tone his speech down a little bit and really understand that being a public figure, being someone that's so well respected in his community, he needs to be very careful with what he says. Yeah. Third point being, just to really, let's be clear here. We're not saying atheists are bad, religious people aren't, or religious people are bad, and atheists. No. When it comes to the human project, in some respects, is a failed project. From the perspective of bloodshed, corruption, tyranny, oppression, human beings have committed and been involved in this stuff, since man first stepped on this earth, right? We have here the narrative of the two sons of Adam in the Quran, as well as in the biblical tradition, which is of Cain and Abel, as we know them. That the first murder to take place on the earth was where one of the sons killed the other out of envy, right? So bloodshed, corruption, terrible things, human beings have it. It's a part of human nature, if not control, to fall into these things, right? So we're not saying religious people are good and atheists are bad. No, religious people too have throughout history done some terrible things. Yeah. Right. But my problem starts when atheists come out and say, look, religions are bad, religions are evil, religious people have done nasty bad things, and put themselves in a position as if atheists have never done anything bad, right? Or people that ascribe to non-belief or call themselves atheists or ascribe to a type of naturalistic philosophy, that they haven't done anything terrible in the world. That's absolutely not true. History is testament to this, right? Yeah. And the last point I want to make on this, bro, is if you like my whole discussion, my whole opening statement in the debate was that if you logically follow through with atheism, in some respect, it puts you in a very dangerous position, because ultimately there's no value, right? There's no difference between a human being and a table and a chair if you logically follow through with naturalism and atheism. That in and of itself is quite an absurd thing to accept. But secondly, if someone was to now accept this, if someone was off a crazy disposition and accepted this outlook fully, that there's no difference between a human being and a table or a chair, we can only begin to imagine the atrocities that type of person, that crazy person with some psychological issues, can commit if he was to, follow through with such implications. That being said, obviously, my objective in the debate, and even it is now, whenever I speak about these things to atheists and I highlight the logical implications of atheism, I'm not there to say that you're an atheist, therefore you should be a bad person if you logically follow through. No, of course not. What I'm trying to highlight whenever I've made these points is that you are a human being. There are certain aspects of your nature which scream out the fact that there is a creator and designer that created you. And from the perspective of existential points, it's that you do have meaning, you do have value, you innately and intrinsically recognize this, but your worldview is not allowing you to be able to account for this or make sense of this, right? And that's the problem. So what you should do is maybe reconsider your atheism, not your nature, right? Because human nature is we innately and intuitively recognize human life is precious. We innately recognize that we should do good and avoid bad. We shouldn't harm people unnecessarily. We should take care of humanity, etc., etc. But all of these innate notions, you can't provide a basis for, an account for, an atheism or naturalism, right? So without going off on too much of a tangent, I think the door swings both ways, when it comes to this. And this whole argument put forward by some atheists that, oh, religions result in violence and evil, and therefore secularism or atheism is the way forward, is just a flawed argument. It's just based on
Definitely.
a lack of understanding on these points.
I've got another bit here where he makes it even more explicit. He says there is no such link between atheism and violence of any kind in any circumstance. Like, of any kind in any circumstance. All you need to do is look up the Soviet Union, the persecution of Christians in the Soviet Union. There's a bit here. The state advocated the destruction of religion, and to achieve this goal, it officially denounced religious beliefs as superstitious and backwards. The Communist Party destroyed churches, synagogues, and mosques, ridiculed, harassed, incarcerated, and executed religious leaders, flooded the schools and media with anti-religious teachings, and introduced a belief system called scientific atheism, with its own rituals, promises, proselytizers. So this idea that atheism in no way has any link to violence in any circumstance, when there's clear evidence historically that it has, this shows it says something about the people that pushed this particular view. You know, that either they don't care, they do know, and they're just they're trying to mislead people. I don't want to think that that's the case, because that's horrible if it is. Or they're just ignorant of it. They've not really looked into it. You know, they've not really checked out the history of atheism, which is something that they massively advocate. And it's this whole idea that if, like you say, there's certain things within human beings that cause things that give rise to conflict. Now, if people do believe in theism and you want to propagate atheism, if you see theism as a threat, it makes sense that you would react to it accordingly. And this isn't to say, like you mentioned, that it's necessarily the case that if you become atheist, you will become violent. I'm not making that argument, and I never will.
Of course not. Yeah, of course not.
And it'd be equally as absurd to make that necessary connection. But it's a possibility, and it has expressed itself historically in the past, and it expresses itself still today. There are atheists that are very militant, you know, that wish violence upon theists, and it doesn't take much research to come across these things, and it doesn't take much thinking to see that there might not be a necessary connection, but atheism not having a doctrine always leaves the possibility of violence open, unless they make some sort of, you know, doctrine or codified ruling where they say no violence is allowed of any kind in any circumstance. But then again, they probably wouldn't be able to just leave it with that. And then you've always got the issue with other atheists saying, well, why should we agree to your doctrine? Who are you, Sam Harris, to codify atheism? And so because he can't codify it, because he can't give a doctrine without becoming himself the atheist prophet, it's always open to this subjectivism, where if someone deems it necessary, and they can gain enough power and enough of a backing, then it's perfectly possible. And you saw the same thing in the French Revolution, when they started moving more towards secularism, and there was thousands and thousands of people being executed, and it was, you know, mostly to do with things like religious leaders, and they were trying to incline towards secularism, so like a you know, and a non-theocratic state.
I guess what we're trying to say is that let's be humble and let's be honest about this. That, you know, on both sides of the fence, people have done some terrible things. So it's not really an argument for or against either side. It's just the reality of human beings, that we humans have the potential to do terrible things, and humans have the potential to do amazing things, right? But to now take, you know, the aspect of the terrible things human beings do and just throw it all onto religion is not an honest position to hold. That's what we're essentially trying to get at and highlight.
There was another bit that he mentioned. I think we've covered that quite well there. So we'll try and move on to a few other points he made. There was a bit that you really drilled into him about his dismissal of testimony. And this was really funny, because then he brought up the whole petri dish thing. You know, and he was obviously quite a lively guy. He was funny to, you know, he had a sense of humor. He was good at trying to catch the crowd. But then there was this bit where he came up with this petri dish thing, and he kind of rambled on a bit with it, and he used it as an explanation as to why we should for example, believe in evolution. And there was a number of things he completely overlooked here. That this itself, in order, because his point, I think was it in his book where he says that testimony is not a valid way.
Yeah, in his book and on his videos online as well. So
can you
he
summarize
rejects
that
testimony.
that view a bit?
Yeah, so he has a very, I think, unorthodox, if you like, if you can call it that, outlook on what constitutes to knowledge and what constitutes to evidence. He rejects pretty much every route to knowledge other than, and he boils it down to evidence is what is based on what's observable, what's shareable, and what's repeatable. That's it, full stop. But in doing so, I think what he's failed to realize is in doing so, he's actually dismissing the scientific method itself. Something he clearly acknowledged, and he said, "I am someone that believes science is the only way to truth." Now, if you are someone that's so such a upholder of the scientific method, and you're someone that believes science is the only way to truth, to tell you about everything, then surely you must know what the scientific method is comprised of. The scientific method, science isn't just observations, right? Observations are a part of science. Bertrand Russell, for example, when he explained or tried to explain what the scientific method was, he said, science, and I'm paraphrasing, science was an attempt to discover by means of observation and reasoning based upon it, particular facts about the world. So essentially what he was saying was that when we do science, we do observations using our senses, we collect data, and then we reason upon the data to come up with our theories and outlooks, etc. And then obviously when scientists have done this and they've produced the theories, then the next step is to, through the process of testimony, you share that data and share those theories, and you pass them on from generation to generation, and you make that knowledge, you spread that knowledge basically to other scientists and to the masses and to the mainstream, etc. So there's a lot more that's going on here. Science isn't just a case of observations. They're observations, they're not science, right? So what's funny, when he was referring to the petri dish, he was pointing towards certain observations you can make in a lab, which show that things change, but in no way, shape, or form was that petri dish experiment the Darwinian mechanism that we learn and we hear of and that we've all become accustomed to hearing.
Definitely.
So I think there was a bit of misunderstanding on his point with regards to what the scientific method was.
Well, from the way he kind of he was quite strict in terms of how he was saying, this is what science is, and like he made it. From what I gathered, if he was to really think about his particular definition that he was putting forward, it would make science something that basically every scientist would reject everything unless they themselves had experienced the results of it. Because there's another thing as well, that there was an article published recently, or somewhat recently anyway, that over 50% of scientific experiments are not repeatable. And these are ones that have been put into the data bank and are assumed to have been correctly done. And when you're going through them, it turns out that it's not as rigorous as you would hope it would be, and that this is a cause of concern within the scientific community, and that this is a problem they have to face and try to overcome. And this idea as well, he completely neglected the fact that within the scientific method, like you say, there's a lot of stuff to do with reasoning reaching to truth. So Aaron Ra, in his arguments with Sabor, he even talks about this idea of micro changes, macro changes, and that if you can see that there are micro changes occurring, if you extend it upon a long enough time scale, then you can deduce from that there would be large scale changes over a long period of time. That's a reasoned argument, which he considers something that's led him to a particular truth claim. And so with this, with the people he's interviewing himself on his Atheist Alliance podcast thing, even they are putting forward things with, in terms of truth claims that haven't been as rigorous as he's hoping that they would be. There's the whole testimony thing as well is implicit in that. You don't have time to, double check absolutely every experiment. You have faith in the community that you find yourself within, the scientific community, that they've done their job well enough, and that the results that they hold have are basically a true result, so that, you know, there's not been problems and things like that, and then you build upon it. And then you mentioned as well, over time, as these experiments kind of move off into the distance, as time moves on, you don't have the time to kind of go over and redo every experiment that's been done over the centuries. You're building upon the shoulders of your predecessors. And, you know, if you want to be quick, and a lot of the times in a capitalist society, you have to be efficient. You can't double check that entire chain. And sometimes as well, there'll be cases where people keep building upon things, and it's not until much later that problems start to arise, which force this, what Kuhn would call, you know, the revolution of the scientific revolutions. And then that's not to mention the fact of what's it called, the eureka moments, how they play a massive part in the scientific revolutions that occur. And this itself isn't something that people necessarily understand. Richard Dawkins has spoke about it. Would there be any kind of like, how would you expand on that? Is there anything else you would?
Yeah, no, I think you've hit the point, nail on the head, bro. With this, he's basically reducing it down to just mere observations and something that could be shared and something that could be tested. But as we know, it's much more than that. And the point about science being a developmental thing is a very important point. You know, to be where we are in the understanding of the world today, and all of the developments we've had in the world today, we've needed that history of science, right? Those decades and centuries of development and testing, etc., and knowledge being passed down from previous scientists, authentic and valid testimony of previous scientists. If it wasn't for every single moment and every single year and every single decade and every single century, then we wouldn't have the things that we find ourselves with today in the 21st century. It just wouldn't be possible, right? So if you're going to throw testimony out the window, then you've pretty much thrown the whole scientific enterprise out the window, right? It just wouldn't work. And if, again, science is done by scientists who are human beings. You know, there's a reason human beings do science, and you don't find cockroaches and ladybirds and cats doing science or making scientific progress, because human beings have a very unique ability, which is this high level of reasoning, right? Which is that we have the ability to take in information, process information, and then produce ideas, right? We have the ability of seeing into the future, which is something remarkable to human beings, that we can have, you know, certain hypotheses, we can have certain outlooks and things that we want to achieve without the human mind, the ability to reason, you know, the rational human faculties. You have no science. It just wouldn't work. So when and the reason I'm mentioning this is that when John Richards comes out and he says in his book that that he doesn't accept the opinions of people, and therefore he's referring to, and the reason he says it is because the opinions of people are something that's tainted. I think these are his words, that's tainted by the human mind, so you can't accept that. Well, again, you're rejecting the scientific enterprise, because scientists do science. And when you say scientists are doing science, they are reasoning and they're using the rational faculties to do science, right? So there's huge problems with his understanding regarding what constitutes knowledge and evidence. And I think for that reason, he landed himself in some very tricky situations during the debate.
Definitely.
You know, and contradicted himself many times too. So yeah, I guess that's it. That's all I like to.
Well, there was an interesting bit as well that kind of popped into my head when I was listening to him talk. It's like he's massively oversimplified the scientific method here, because there's also a massive importance in terms of the creative approach to science. Like, in order to make progress, or to kind of move into a niche area, there's a lot of kind of hypothesizing that has to take place. That is, people have to start somewhere, they give their opinions, and then you kind of work through the opinions, and then you'll hack at them, you'll maybe do some tests to see which opinions start to fall apart and things like that. But that whole opinion part is a massive part of the process. It's the first step in a lot of cases, especially when you're moving into realms that haven't had much development previously. So like when all of these things started unraveling with quantum mechanics, the quantum physics, there was a lot of creativity that was needed in order to try and figure out which direction to start moving in first. And this involved ideas, opinions, and then working at them, hacking at them. But it's not that it was that science is completely against opinions, like this kind of anti-subjective thing that they often try to kind of push when you're dealing with atheists. They've made subjective this kind of dirty word. But you've got to start somewhere, and subjective opinion are usually the very first point of departure, and then it's this relationship between that and the objective method, where you're trying to establish at what point someone might be onto something, and things like that. So it's really weird. It did seem like he'd massively oversimplified this, and then that got him into a bit of a sticky situation. We won't go into that too much as well, because that'll be interesting for people to watch when you release the debate.
And I guess there's another point to add there, is that if you understand the way science works, you will also realize that science doesn't lead to absolutes. That's another interesting thing about. So if you're someone that's saying, I believe science is the only way to truth, that in itself is false, because science doesn't deal with absolutes. It doesn't deal with truth as in absolute truth. It can just give you an approximation what's most likely to be correct in regards to the material physical world around us. Not that it's absolutely true in any way, shape, or form, right? So, and again, you see people like Richard Dawkins and individuals like this that will push evolution and say it's a fact, it's absolute on popular level. When you really know that it's not a fact, it's not absolute, it's probably the best work, as Samburu says, it's probably the best working model that we have. That's fine, but there's other models. This is like 3 or 4, I think 5 other main models that are out there that are equally as valid as the Darwinian mechanism. But we don't, he wouldn't promote those. So it shows there's a lot here at play. Those that are championing and science and making science out to be this method to absolute truth in regards to everything, they themselves are adopting methods which are beyond the scope of science to make their points. And it's a very interesting contradiction you see unfolding in some of these people, like Richard Dawkins, when they're making their points. And I'm sure people will pick up on this as they watch this stuff and learn more about this stuff.
Can I ask, do you think sometimes the issue is a semantical one? Like they're using these particular definitions in their head and they're not really making it too clear?
Yeah, no doubt. To be nuanced, absolutely. Sometimes, and it's because most, studying the philosophy of science isn't a critical study when you're getting engaged in the sciences, right? So you study science, and then there's a philosophy of science, which is a separate subject. Although I believe it should be taught together, because once you understand how science works, then can you truly maximize the benefit from it. So I think in many cases, or lots of cases, there are genuine errors people make. They just don't know the difference. They don't know what they mean by a scientific truth, a scientific fact. And it's perfectly reasonable to use a fact of science, but you have to really understand what you mean by fact of science when you use that word within the scope of science. I think some people just sheer ignorance, or just out of ignorance, and I'm not saying that in any vindictive way, and not that I've studied the philosophy of science to any great deal, or science for that matter, but just a lack of understanding of the scientific method leads people to make certain statements that may come across in a certain way mainstream when people listen to people talking about this. But I don't think that's the case with people like Richard Dawkins. I think they're very well aware of what they're saying and how they're manipulating words. And one reason to believe this is when he was asked, I think in one of his discussions, whether we should study the philosophy of science, he said, no, don't study the philosophy of science, just do the science. I wonder why. I don't see any problem in studying the philosophy of science. If anything, it'll help you better.
You would think, wouldn't you, that it maybe give you like a stronger foundation to promote your position from, if especially if you're so confident that it's the way, the truth, the light.
Yes, absolutely.
I did an article on something kind of similar to this problem. It was basically to do with this idea of the vacuum, and it was a contention that Descartes had with Galileo, and it really highlights this issue with semantics. And so Galileo, he had done a number of experiments to prove what he referred to as a vacuum. And he called it a vacuum, and it was basically to do with when you polish two metal surfaces and put them close enough together, that there's a force that pulls them together, and he called it the vacuum. And he was basically saying that all of the molecules that were between that has been pushed out of the way, and this has caused a pulling force between the two objects. And Descartes absolutely hated the fact that they were calling this a vacuum. And and basically it's this idea that you can have space with nothing in it. And his argument, to kind of really summarize it, was that, well, so long as like, if you're talking about nothing, and if you're saying that a vacuum is nothing, you're completely overlooking the fact that nothing has no qualities. And so if there is dimension, so if there's space, like an X, Y, Z, then you have something. Even if you've taken molecules out of there, you can't refer to it as nothing, because nothing doesn't have qualities. So therefore, his argument is that the vacuum is still something. And then you see this argument, and Descartes was quite brilliant, because this occurred centuries ago. And then you see this argument still being played out today when you look at people like Lawrence Krauss, and like he's messing around with this idea of what we call nothing. And he's saying, oh well, a universe from nothing, and then he lists out a massive number of pages where he's describing nothing with all of these qualities. And this really touches on this idea of semantics and people using a particular word, not really thinking too much about the implications of a particular use of that word. And you see this expressing itself with the atheist community, like, for example, John Richards, who you were discussing with, Lawrence Krauss, etc. But it's really interesting to kind of see. And another thing you wanted to speak about was the implications of his arguments with regards to morality. Do you want to touch on that briefly, or just kind of start that bit off?
So from reading his passages in his book on the chapter on morality, it seems like his outlook is that morals have evolved, and some of it's to do with nurture. So some of it's to do with just social upbringing and the way we're brought up in society and certain social norms, etc. Now, this is very similar to Dawkins' idea that he presents in Outgrowing God. Dawkins obviously is a bit more careful. Like he doesn't give a clear picture as to how he grounds his morality. He doesn't give it a clear ontological foundation for morality. He just says there's something up in the air, some of it's evolution, and some of it's things that people discuss in social norms, etc.
The dinner table stuff.
It's exactly. You have you read that?
It's a friend of mine had it on his. He took the bit of that conversation and put it onto his Twitter, and it was a perfect little moment where it just really expressed the subjectivity of their morality. Like a lot of it's just
it's crazy, bro. It's like they go from such a shoddy grounds, where they have literally no grounds to stand on. Yet from that point, they project such a forceful, moral outlook and
moral fanatics.
Condemn. Yeah, it's crazy. I just don't get it. Like today, I was watching. I put a video out today on Hitchens. Now, the reason I did this because Hitchens, one of the things Hitchens was known for, he wasn't too much of a logician. He wasn't too much into sort of arguments against theism. He wasn't of that disposition. He was more of a rhetorician. He was very rhetorical. He was a very powerful speaker. And one of the things he did a lot was that he was on a moral warpath against religion, right? He just wanted to say this was wrong and that was wrong and this was evil and that's evil and this is why the Bible is nasty and this is why Islam is terrible. This is all he did all his life. Yet near the end of his life, in a debate, interestingly, between him and his brother, when the point about morality is brought out and he's asked as to how he accounts for his moral outlook, he just turns around and say, well, he says, well, look, it's just it's approximations. We just have to go by what's approximate. And then near the end of it, he sort of refers to evolution a bit, and he says Penguin evolution. But it just shows them such shoddy grounds when it comes to them being able to peg down how they anchor their morality. What is their morality grounded in? There's nothing really, right? Yet when they speak out against religions and they engage on that epistemic level with other outlooks, they just speak as if they are on such solid grounds, as if there's a god of atheism which they peg their morals in, and that allows for them to account for objective morals. It's crazy. It's like whichever way you look at it, whether you look at it from the perspective of moral realism, whether you look at it from the perspective of morals evolving, consequentialism, types of utilitarianism, at the end of the day, no matter which way you spin it, you're going to end up with a conclusion that morals on atheism and naturalism at best are subjective. You cannot provide them. Yeah,
I'd probably refer to it as intersubjective, because it's not that they're not rooted in anything. It's just what they're rooted in is
Yeah.
itself very malleable, very flexible. And so
Yes.
when you're making a particular claim, like for example, when you're talking about Hitchens, what he generally tends to do, from what I can see, is he's appealing to the popular opinion. So he says, obviously this is wrong, when he's talking about a particular religion, and he's like, he pulls out a particular claim, and he's appealing to the spirit of the time, the zeitgeist, and
Yeah.
and he pitches it in a particular way, which, like you say, he was a very good public speaker. He was very good at pulling a crowd along with him. And if you're good at this and you're dealing with laymen, you don't necessarily need to give them the foundation, because you're working upon their own assumptions. And so it's very
Yes.
easy to just kind of work the crowd when you're working on things that they already agree with. And so, yeah, it has a foundation. It's just its foundation is problematic, and it kind of boils down to this whole will to power. So
Yes.
if you're going to say that it's wrong, all right, fair enough, go for it, but don't make the claim that it's objectively wrong. What they'll generally have to kind of lead it to is that, well, we believe this, you believe that, there's a conflict between these two particular values or these two ideas. Now, how do we resolve that? Well, you can't say that, well, ours is definitely right, because it's based within an intersubjectivity. And if it is based within intersubjectivity, from the position of atheism, and so is theirs. So in their particular locality, their belief is as correct as yours is in your particular location. There's only the conflicts when these two places or these two groups clash or move close together and begin to overlap, that this tension begins to arise. Nietzsche kind of highlights what you've said here as well. It's one of my favorite quotes from him, but this is a critique specifically of Christianity. I'll read through it really quickly. They are rid of the Christian God and now believe all the more firmly that they must cling to Christian morality. This is an English consistency. We do not wish to hold it against them. In England, one must rehabilitate oneself after every emancipation from theology by showing in a veritably awe-inspiring manner what a moral fanatic what one is. This is the penance they pay there. And this pretty much sums up everything you've just said there. These dogmatic atheists, they become vehemently more moralistic the more atheistic they become, the more they hold on to it. And it's very bizarre to kind of see this kind of unfold as you're dealing with these atheist figures, the popular ones.
Nietzsche is, because Hamza mentioned this, very interesting. He met up with one of the leading professors of Nietzsche a little while back, and he told him something very interesting, because we hear the statement of Nietzsche where he said God is dead, and we think, oh, this is just Nietzsche was an atheist and he was on the same bandwagon as we are, and he was upholding a cause. But what's interesting is what he meant by that. What he was trying to highlight was that he was speaking to those of the secular disposition, and he was telling them that, look, you've let go of the Christian God, but what you don't realize, you're still holding on to the values that came with that Christian God. And what's going to happen in the coming centuries is you're not going to be able to account for those values anymore, those ethics anymore, and you're going to eventually end up letting go of them. And hence he predicted the sort of nihilistic coming centuries, right? And it was quite profound. I think his insights were profound, and I don't think most people understood that at the time. And also, another thing is, when you peg, now it's interesting the way you differentiate that they do peg morality in something, which is important. So someone may peg morality in the whole process of evolution. Now, what that means is a whole other kettle of fish, but the issue is that it doesn't bring a sense of duty, right? So that's another thing. So when we say we as Muslims peg our moral outlook or our moral ontologies based on the fact that God exists, and we peg morality in God, that comes with duty as well, that there is an ought that's pressing down us to act in a moral way. Because what we're saying, in other words, is because we understand from the Islamic tradition that God is Al-Bar, for example. He's the source of all goodness. Hence, whatever he commands is good. So when God has created us as moral beings, and we know the difference between right and wrong, then there's a duty to act out as far as doing what's right and avoiding what's wrong, right? Whereas pegging your morals on anything else, something subjective like the changes of morality, of evolution, etc., you're basically you at best you may be able to say, okay, we've evolved to have certain abilities that allow us to produce morals, but in no way, shape, or form does that bring that sense of duty to morals, nor does it tell us what morals are, what's right and what's wrong. So there's huge issues if you were to peg your morals in anything other than God, other than the fact that you can't call them objective in the true sense.
Well, they both down pretty much to just morality is kind of that which just allows your species to continue. One of the big issues that I have with that is that it's not necessarily about the species, because you when you look at the animal kingdom, there's always conflict within a species. So they'll compete over territory. They'll compete over plenty of things. And you know, if you want to include us with that, then at what point do you draw the line? Why is it necessarily the case that we should make that line a global one? Why should we think in terms of, I agree that we should think globally, but I do this from the perspective of theism, you know, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that he sent the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, for all mankind, not specifically for the Arabs, not specifically for, you know, any particular person. Now, from the perspective of this kind of rootless atheism, from their perspective anyway, and from this idea of just simply, you know, morality being that which allows your species to survive, it gives rise to these particular problems where it's like, well, the lines you're drawing in terms of the survivability of who exactly becomes questionable and arbitrary and up for debate, and something that not everyone's going to agree on. Like, should it be the nation state? So, for example, why shouldn't America be completely nationalistic? Why shouldn't they think themselves as they say, the greatest nation on earth? And if something is going to conflict with the values that they uphold, why should they just tolerate it or befriend it, or, you know, and just kind of allow it to amalgamate?
So where to draw the line? That's what we're saying. It's like, how do you know where to draw the line?
Exactly.
You know, what do you mean by the collective, the whole? What do you mean by that? There's issues within issues. It's like it's almost like an infinite regress of issues when you try to peg morality in anything other than God. But I think that suffices that point as well. I think we've hammered that one out quite well. Anything else you want to add to regarding John Richard's sort of what you took from it?
Well, there was a particular at the end there was the Q&A, and I tried to post my question, but for whatever reason, I think there was quite a lot of people asking them, so I never actually had an opportunity to have my answer. So I'll put this out, and inshallah, maybe John Richards will hear it, and if he does, that'd be fantastic, because I'd love to hear his response to this. John, if you're watching, please leave it in the comment, or if you can try to contact us in some other way, that'd be great. So my question was this: is that it was to do, because you mentioned this briefly during the debate as well, where you talked about the fact that, oh, I think my daughter's coming upstairs. I'll ask it quickly and then we'll conclude. It was the fact that if evolution is something that is driven by truth, why is it that the human species the particular human races that were the most successful, or the civilization, should I say, were the ones that were religious? If truth gives rise to surviving, why is it that we ended up with the only species, the human species, giving rise to... The baby's broken into the office. Bear with me.
A few moments later.
Sorry about that. So the question was, if survivability of the species and evolution itself is something driven by truth, and you know that which is the most true gives rise to survival, then why is it that every single civilization that was successful, religious, and if it's not based on truth, if it isn't truth driven, and you can say, well, you know, religion is the biggest lie that any species has come up with. If that's the case, then how can he trust his own cognitive faculties? And it's a double-edged sword here. If he says that evolution gives rise, basically truth leads to survivability, to the extension of your species, why is the most successful species on Earth religious? And if it doesn't give rise to truth, then why are you trusting the scientific method, which relies upon the cognitive faculties, which gave rise to religion in the first place? And how would he answer that? Like, have you got a particular perspective on that?
to be honest, he may just turn around and say, well, evolution doesn't lead to truth, right? He may just acknowledge that it's not about truth, it's about survival. That which lands in, like you said, it's a double-edged sword, landing in basically there's nowhere to go, right? And this is what you've highlighted is one of the paradoxes that atheists will run into every so often. Sorry, my voice has been going since earlier today, so it's probably getting slightly worse for me to understand. But I think what that particular question does is it highlights the contradictions which surround atheism, right? And you can't escape them. It's and that in and of itself, and this is something I mentioned that day too. Too much of the time we get caught up with the atheists in the type of discourse which is about, here's my argument, you decide whether this makes sense or not. Here's my proof, you decide whether you accept this or not. And we go back and forth like this. But I think what's profound, and I think with most atheists will appreciate, simply if you highlight the contradictions that are prevalent under this outlook on life, that should be enough reason to get people to start thinking, you know what, this simply doesn't make sense or add up from many different perspectives. And the intelligent person at that point will realize, you know what, I need to look elsewhere. I don't even have to get to the realm of arguments against God or for God, etc. I can work with this on a more basic level. I'm holding to a worldview which on one end I'm thinking I'm on stable ground, but upon looking down at your feet, you realize that you're just sinking down this bottomless hole, basically.
Yeah,
right?
self-defeating.
And that should really, and that should get the person who's awake and intelligent to realize, you know what, whoa, this doesn't make any sense. I need to look elsewhere. Is this conclusive proof for theism? Of course not. But at the very least, it should get the thinking man or woman to really reconsider their position and start looking elsewhere. And that's essentially what we're trying to get at with most of the stuff we're talking
about.
Definitely.
That's a very brilliant point to kind of end on as well, because just to make this clear, like you say, this itself isn't conclusive proof in theism, and it's not conclusive proof in Islam in particular. What it is it's just pointing out the presuppositions of atheism and things like that as being this kind of philosophical Ouroboros, or that the snake that eats its own tail. It undermines itself. And with this, you can at least, once you've figured out to this degree, as we've stated here, that there's a lot of issues with a lot of these assumptions that should move you away from it. And if it's moving you away from this in particular, that means you need to move towards something else. Because you're again, we're human beings. We need something. We need some sort of mental schematic to be able to view the world through. To be able to acknowledge things meaningfully. And it's impossible to reach this completely meaningless state, because even nihilists still view the world through a meaningful lens, i.e. nihilism. That's probably best we leave it there, because I think we're battering your throat a bit.
No, but it's good, man. We should carry this on. We should do more videos, inshallah.
Yeah, definitely. Inshallah. But thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Is there anything you want to finish with, or?
No, the debate will be out very soon, inshallah. So definitely check that out.
You have a date for that?
Not a date, but it should be out in the next week, inshallah. So soon, it'll be in the IRA channel. Make sure to subscribe to Pondering Soul. It's a brilliant channel, mashallah. It's good. Inshallah, brother Yusuf is going to put out some. I don't know if they know your name. I'll just say your name publicly.
Yusuf.
Exactly. Yusuf, they know your name. Okay. Yeah, inshallah, you put some amazing stuff out, and I'm sure you're going to put some amazing stuff out in the future going forward as well. I'd love to do more collaborations with you, bro, as well. I think it gets me to think through some ideas as well, and I've really benefited from you as well, because I had some discussions with you prior to the debate, and you gave me some really interesting insights from your background, your philosophical background, which was very helpful. I think this will benefit people, and we'll carry this on, inshallah.
And make sure also to subscribe to your channel. Is it Epistemics, or because I've noticed as well when I've tried to look for it? Is Imran Hussein?
Yeah, I've changed the name of the channel, so it's Imran Hussein basically.
Okay, so I'll leave links.
Epistemics was a project which I started with the podcast, but I haven't been able to do that, so I thought it was only fitting to just rename the channel, because I just don't like to do at the moment on it.
Okay. Well, yes, I'll leave links to that in the description. I'll get your social media bits, and I'll put that in the description as well. So do make sure to subscribe to his channel, follow him on Twitter. Have you got Facebook as well?
Yeah.
If you've got a Facebook page, I'll link that as well. But yeah, so inshallah, we'll try to do something again in the future. But other than that, thank you for joining us, everyone. Make sure to leave comments. If you've got any questions, I'll try and get Imran to keep an eye out for them. And inshallah, we'll try and answer a couple of them here and there. But other than that, jazakallah khair for watching. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.